There's everywhere.
Well, welcome everybody. This is an exciting opportunity to meet our new state representative, Tami Gouveia. And I told her we're holding her to account on what happened in the first session because we voted for her and we're quite proud of her. She hit the ground running and covers so many areas, not just her main strength is public health. She's done a lot of work, especially with young people on drug prevention, and especially young teenagers. And she's also working on the opioid crisis. That's going to be her PhD topic at BU. Also at BU, she has gained 2 masters, and she has worked as a strong leader in the Lowell area. She comes from Acton, but she grew up in Lowell, and she has worked to bring people of diverse opinions together. And we think that's going to be very effective in the House. She also knows about our interest in climate change, but that's not all she's going to talk about today. So I'm very happy to introduce our state representative, Tami Gouveia.
Wow, you know my bio. That's really impressive. Thank you for that introduction. Tami Gouveia, I am really, really glad to be here. Can everybody hear me okay, or do you need me to speak closer? Okay, just want to make sure. So as was mentioned by Bobby, I did grow up in Lowell and moved to Acton about 9 years ago with my children. I have 2 teenagers. One I sent off to college this summer, and I have another one who's 15, and my older one graduated from Acton-Boxborough. My younger one is a sophomore at Acton-Boxborough. And as Bobby mentioned, I do feel like I hit the ground running. That was my commitment to you, was to just really dive right into the legislative process. You may or may not know that I was a lobbyist against the tobacco industry, so I had already spent time in the State House, which was really fortunate because the building is very confusing if you've ever been there. It's split into 2 halves physically, so it's a little convoluted to get around the State House. But then also trying to understand the legislative process, it was a little bit less of a learning curve for me than for some of my colleagues. But I'll tell you, the breadth of issues that come flooding at us as state reps is really overwhelming at times, I'll be honest. And in our first year, we're only provided with 1 staff person. Emily Odgers is my staff. If you ever call the office, she is the wonderful, really friendly, super smart, talented young woman who will answer my phones and try to answer your questions. And if she can't answer your question right then and there, she will do the research to get back to you and do all that she can to help you navigate whatever questions or issues that you're experiencing. So I'm really grateful to Emily. She was my campaign manager, so we've been together for over a year now, working together to really provide the best services and support to the folks of the 14th Middlesex. My district includes all of Concord, all of Carlisle, half of Acton, and 2 precincts in Chelmsford. So just to kind of give you a little bit of a lay of the land, it's a relatively diverse district in that sense. And I have really worked hard to make sure that I'm listening to many diverse perspectives as a legislator. I am a strong Democrat. I sit with all of the Republicans, so I've made really good friends with the Republicans around me where we sit in chambers. So let me give you a little bit of a sense of what now we're almost 9 months, a little over 9 months in. The first couple weeks are really about filing pieces of legislation and figuring out what bills as legislators we will co-sponsor. I authored 19 of my own pieces of legislation, and I signed on to over 300 pieces of legislation. Wow. And the ways that I made the decision of what I would support were based on 3 things. The first is, if constituents asked me to sign on to a piece of legislation, I looked at it, I read it, and I decided if it was something that I thought was good for the district and good for the Commonwealth. The second folks that reached out are the advocacy organizations, from teachers associations and unions to healthcare providers and environmental groups. So if they had a particular piece of legislation that was important to them and their constituency, I took a look at that piece of legislation. And then the third was, if I heard about something or colleagues asked me to sign on to it, I took a look at that piece of legislation. There are over 6,000 bills that get filed in the Massachusetts legislature every single session. You may or may not know we're in formal session, a year and a half, starting January of the odd year into July 31st of the even year. And then there's, for the rest of the session for the second year, it's all informal sessions, which mean we don't take up any controversial bills. So we try to do as much as we can in the first year and a half to make sure we're taking up the bills that might have a little bit more contention so that we're really weighing in and then we're all present to be able to take the vote in formal session. So as I indicated, 6,000 bills filed in the Massachusetts legislature. Only 2 to 3% pass every single session. So a very, very small percentage goes into actually passing bills. On average, it takes about 6 years, so 3 sessions, for a bill to pass. Part of that's good for democracy because you want a deliberative body, but part of it is also bad when you think about the climate crisis that we're facing. It means that we're acting a little bit too slowly and not boldly enough, in my opinion, and I've been pretty vocal about this up at the State House whenever there's been hearings before the specific committees that those bills go to. So just want to give you a little bit of that context of how many bills, what it takes to I can't read all 6,000 bills. My staff, my one person, we can't read all 6,000. So that's why I really, truly rely on you and the constituents in the district to tell me what are your priorities, what are the things that you care most about. And then I go to the organizations that have a large constituency that advocate on issues that I care about. So that was the first month. The second month and the third month was we started to take up some bills, started to have some hearings. I sit on 4 committees. I sit on mental health, substance use, and recovery. The second committee I sit on is children, families, and persons with disabilities. The third is export development, and the fourth is consumer protection and professional licensure. We have hearings about 2 to 3 times per month for all of those committees, except for the export development is a little bit less active than the other committees. And it just has to do with the kinds of bills that get referred to those committees. So I think for mental health, substance use, and recovery, we have, I think, about 250 bills or so. There are other committees up at the State House that get 700 bills that they have to vet. In the Massachusetts Constitution, every single bill that gets filed, whether it's to get an extra liquor license at a local level or a big bill like criminal justice reform that we passed last year, every single bill gets a hearing, at least in one committee in the State House. So we're very, very active in holding those hearings and working through those bills and rewriting bills and voting on those. One of the things that I did really early on, and I'm really glad that you use the word hold us to account or hold me to account, because that is exactly what I hope for. I'm tickled when people hold me accountable, and it's what I also expect from our citizens, is that people hold us accountable as elected officials. And the thing that I've done to try to make your job as a citizen a little bit easier is trying to really communicate what are the votes that I've taken, how am I thinking about particular issues, whether it's votes that I've taken in committee or votes that I've taken in the chamber. And those soon will all go up on my website. It's taking us a little bit to get all of that up there. But the reason why I do that is there's no process right now in the legislature to make it public what our votes are. And you may or may not have noticed, newspapers used to do a really, really superb job of reporting what was going on up at the State House, but they're slightly less interested right now. And, with the ways that the media has gone with large corporations buying up the smaller newspapers, it makes it a lot harder for us who are in the legislature to get the word out about what we're doing and what's kind of going on. So it's incumbent upon those of us who are elected to be our own sort of advocates or our own communicators of what votes we've taken and what the positions are. So that's one thing I've done. The other thing I did is right at the beginning, I was part of a group of legislators voting to change the rules in the legislature, change the rules in the House so that we could increase the transparency. And that's, again, to make votes public and really make them publicized. The other thing is, oftentimes we get bills, we don't have a whole lot of time to review them. There are bills that I have to take up and try to figure out what they're saying. Some of them are very long and complicated, and we might have less than a day to review those particular pieces of legislation before I have to make a decision about whether or not they're good for you, the citizens of the 14th Middlesex District. So one of the rules changes that I was advocating for with some of my colleagues is to give us 72 hours to review a bill and 24 hours to review any amendments before we vote on them. That went down, it didn't pass. There were, I think, 45 of us who voted in support of that out of 160. It's not the worst thing to have 45 out of 160. I'm sure where you're sitting, you're feeling like that's terrible. On the numbers, it is terrible, but if you want to look at progress, I'm hoping that next session we'll have more people who will be with us in voting to change those particular rules, because they govern how the House of Representatives runs itself. And that's why the rules at the beginning of the year that the legislators pass is critically important. So I've also been really trying to be present and active in the district, attending events, forums like this. I love being invited to talk about what's going on at the State House, one-on-one meetings with constituents to find out, what are your ideas and your issues. The primary things that I heard about and ran on when I was running for office was healthcare, transportation, and climate change, as well as getting corporate money out of politics and opening up access to our government. The things I've done around transportation is I've gone physically to the train platforms 3 mornings in the month of June and talked to commuters as they were boarding to get onto the train to head to Boston or to Cambridge to get to work or to school, to understand what are the challenges that they face. It's only the beginning. I also heard a lot about the lack of transportation within the towns, lack of transportation for seniors and those with disabilities, lack of transportation for teenagers. So really been asking a lot. I've been asking a lot of questions, reading a lot of reports to really understand what is happening at the administrative and the legislative level around transportation. We will be voting on a transportation bond bill in probably a couple months. It will be released in October. I met with Chairman Strauss on the House side last week to explain to him what were the challenges that folks in the district experience when it comes to transportation and what are some of the ideas and ways that we can invest in local shuttle or in buses to get people easier to Alewife or into the city. Route 2 is just such a disaster. It took me almost 2 hours to get to work today. It's only supposed to take 49 minutes. It's just on. And I'm sure you hear about this from your families and you experience it yourself. On the climate change side, I filed a net zero stretch energy code. We know that primarily the carbon emissions come from transportation for about 42%. Buildings contribute 40% of carbon emissions. And so we really need to be talking a lot about what's happening with our buildings. And there's not a whole lot of attention paid to buildings quite yet. So that bill did get a hearing. It was voted out favorably out of the Telecommunications, Utilities, and Energy Committee. I don't know where it's going to go, though, because we did vote on GreenWorks, which is a step in the right direction. When I testified in support of GreenWorks, I also pushed on the committee to say this is not bold enough and it's not comprehensive enough of a bill. We need the roadmap bill because it will really lay out how we're going to get from where we are to where we want to go to reduce our carbon emissions. We need to really be taking a look at 100% renewables to really push us in that direction as quickly as possible. So really just been paying attention to the various pieces of legislation. And I think the majority of those 300 bills that I signed on to were in the climate environment space, from protecting our pollinators to expanding solar and electric vehicles to addressing, deforestation because we need carbon sinks and those kinds of things. And then in terms of healthcare, I'm the co-chair of the caucus around Medicare for All, looking at what can we do to ensure greater access. I heard repeatedly when I was campaigning how much the premiums and deductibles are killing people, how much the cost of prescription drugs is really putting people at really grave risk, and the tough choices that people are having to make. I know of so many people who cannot get in to see their doctor early enough for what they really need. So, there were counter arguments to single payer healthcare and what that might mean. I don't know anybody who loves their insurance company. I understand that it's the system that we're used to, and so there's probably a lot of concern and fear about what a single payer healthcare system might mean. But it's a conversation that I think is really, really important for us to have in our state, because healthcare really ought to be a right, and we should not be putting people in these really tough positions that people are in every single day. And I hear about it every single day. I'll say one other thing about what I've been doing around opioids, and then I'd love to open it up for conversation and questions. So as was mentioned, I'm working on a doctorate in public health focused on opioid policies. I went to Portugal. I'm part of the Portuguese caucus. Gouveia is a Portuguese name. I am of Portuguese descent, first woman of Portuguese descent elected to the Massachusetts legislature. And so as a member of the Portuguese caucus, a delegation of us went to Portugal just as like an exchange. But I took a couple extra days on my own so that I could talk to administrators and care providers and policymakers, because they have a totally different approach than what we have in Massachusetts. And I'm really curious about what we can learn from what their system is. They have just a whole variety of ways of diverting people from using drugs, particularly teenagers, when it comes to marijuana. That's been really shown to be pretty effective. So been paying attention to what's going on in other states as well, so that we can really address the opioid crisis and the addiction crisis that we're facing right now. So those are the highlights. There's a whole lot more, and I'm sure as you ask questions, I'll think of more things to cover, but would love to hear your questions and your thoughts. Bobby?
Thank you for coming. I was so happy to hear that you're working on public transportation. I've been driving for 50 years, and the amount of cars on our highways is insane. I mean, we just can't continue. Okay, so but my other concern is gun control. And
great. So comment about I'm going to repeat what folks are saying. Comment about transportation and just how many cars are on our highways. I completely agree. It's one of the reasons why I support the North-South Rail Link. It will take 55,000 cars off the road every single day, which means we're reducing congestion, and we're also reducing our carbon emissions and getting people moving a lot more efficiently. There's a whole lot of waste that goes on with the stub system that's set up for North-South Rail Link. In terms of gun legislation, I'm glad you asked about that. Thank you. That's a really, really, really important issue. I supported before I was elected, I supported the passage of the red flag law that will allow police and family members to be able to petition a state court to have weapons removed from a home if there's any concerns about someone harming themselves or others. Massachusetts has been and is a leader on gun legislation. I think that's really important. There's obviously more that we can do. We really need to get a handle on and pass universal background checks across the country. We have them here in Massachusetts. We're really lucky, and it protects our first responders, particularly when responding to domestic violence calls. Those are the ones that put them at the greatest risk, as well as the victims of domestic violence. So it's really important that we figure out ways to get some of these laws passed all across the state. And there are some pieces of legislation that are pending and that I'm taking a look at. We have really great champions in Representative David Linsky from parts of Framingham and Natick. He's been very active on this. He was a prosecutor, so has really seen firsthand what some of the issues are when it comes to gun violence. But we also have to figure out what's happening in our inner cities. We know that so many of the guns that end up on the streets of Boston come from other states. So we need to be working with our other state partners to close some of those loopholes, the gun show loopholes, and the other loopholes that allow people to go and purchase guns without any other checks that are required of licensed gun dealers in our state. So I hope that answers your question. I don't know if you have anything. Yeah.
It did. I wish, I'll speak loud. I wish people who are not for gun control would really carefully read the Second Amendment. It does not say that anybody can have an AK, I mean, assault rifle. It just doesn't.
Yeah. And can you say your name, please?
Linda Cohen.
Linda, thank you. So Linda was just articulating that she wishes that folks who are against any sort of sensible gun legislation to take a look at the Second Amendment and read the part where it says the regulation part. There is one other thing that I think is really important, and you sort of said it in the introduction, Bobby, that I am trying to have conversations with people who might disagree with me on some of these issues. I've been very public about where I stand on gun legislation and some of the racist attacks in other parts of the country where people are using guns and using some of the national rhetoric to really go after people of color and immigrants in particular. And I've had constituents come after me and really push back, and I've just really tried to engage in a dialogue instead of engaging in this sort of divisive, well, I'm going to keep to my position and I'm going to ignore and disrespect your position. I don't think that helps us. I think we need to have a real national conversation, and part of that starts right here by engaging in that active dialogue. So I thank you for raising that. There are a couple. Yeah, someone has the mic back there. Yes, how are you?
I have the mic. It's Sharon Wyman, and I have met you before. Love you, and
Nice
thank
to
you
see
for
you.
coming. I have a question about recycling. We are recycling, well, at least we think we are. I have called the company for us who says that they are recycling, and yet I keep reading that a lot of what we think is recycling is going into the landfill. And number one, it seems to me illogical now to put them all together, the single stream or whatever they call it, because the plastics are going with everything else. We know how and can recycle paper, we can recycle metal, we can recycle glass. We did it that way before. If the plastics are contaminating the recycling and ending up in the landfill, that seems to be a problem that's maybe at least partially fixable until we figure out what the devil to do with the rest of the plastics. Where is that? And I can't get an answer at the State House long before you were elected. And I can't get I don't think a straight answer from anybody. And where do you go to get a straight answer about that?
That is a really great question. And you and I spoke about this a very long time ago and still have not been able to find the answer out, but I'll connect with my aide, Emily, to see what she can find out. I will say what I'm hearing from people who are very active in the recycling movement is when in doubt, throw it out, which makes me really sad. I have been an avid recycler since 1990, so for a very long time before it was kind of a cool and the right thing to do. And I think the challenge is in particular the plastics and the paper and not so much the other recyclable materials. I think the other message that I've been trying to get out, and the roadmap bill kind of covers some of this as well, is really reducing how much we consume, addressing the waste that's in packaging. There is some legislation around that, and getting really serious around, reducing waste wherever we can and reusing wherever we can. And so I'll work with Emily to find out what's happening with the recycling issue in particular, but I think there is this sort of newer sentiment of when in doubt, throw it out or separate it out. I think the single stream is what I'm hearing is kind of a little bit of a challenge for us, and nobody's wanting to take our recycling. And I don't know where it's ending up. So thank you for raising that, Sharon. Gordon is in charge.
Thank you. It's clear you really did hit the ground running. Although I must say, when you say you get 24 hours to review a bill, I'm absolutely horrified. I mean, how in the world can you do that? But my question has to do with public transportation. When we moved here, one of the things that I was impressed by was the accessibility of public transportation. And I went and got myself a Charlie card and all that. I have yet to use public transportation. To go into Cambridge and Boston, which I do frequently, I either drive myself or I call Lyft. And the reason is the lack of parking. Whether it's here in Concord or up at the one in Cambridge, Alewife. If you're not there, I gather by 7:30 in the morning, you've had it. And obviously, retired people don't necessarily get there by 7:30 in the morning. And it just means that something which could be enormously helpful. Another aspect of that is that this place is chronically short of help, mainly lower paid help. And we hear all the time that the reason is that there is no transportation between the towns. I mean, if you don't want to go in and out of Cambridge or Boston, there's just no way to get here.
Right.
And I just wonder, sort of taking every second car off the road, is there any kind of action that could make public transportation more useful to more people?
Great. So then the nitty gritty of the question is, the last part of what you said is, are there strategies or things that we can do to make public transportation more accessible for folks and get more people using it? So I love this question. I talk about transportation all the time. I also hate this question at the same time because I wish we weren't having to ask ourselves it. So there's a couple things that when I met with Chairman Strauss and also with the speaker, that I shared with him that I learned from constituents and other folks who have been doing transportation a lot. Yes, the parking is a huge issue. I have experienced it myself as someone who lives in Acton. If I don't get to the Acton lot by 7:15, I then have to come and drive into West Concord, which is adding to my commute and putting more carbon into the air, which we don't need. And so one of the things that Acton has done is they have shuttles from satellite parking to address the first mile, last mile issue. That's what we call it in the transportation world. And there are two shuttle spots, one at the West Acton Fire Station and one at a local church. So it's not a for-profit entity where we're renting any lots. It costs $1 for the shuttle to get there and $1 to get back. Drops you right off at the front entrance of the train station and picks you up right from there. And I think the runs it might be like the first 4 trains departing in the morning and the first 4 that arrive in the afternoon. I would say it's not sufficient. There's probably some more demand there that could be tapped into over time. But I will say in Acton, what they're doing right now is exploring adding a 3rd shuttle. And the challenge that we have is it doesn't make sense to add more parking spaces. A lot of people say, well, just build a garage, add more parking. It costs about $40,000 per parking space. If you pay somebody to drive a shuttle and you buy the shuttle or you contract with, there are various companies and organizations that run shuttle buses, talking about $100,000. It's much more efficient and it gets people moving from point A to point B and you're not taking up more land to build parking if you're just using parking lots that already exist that are just underutilized. So that's one strategy that I did share with the chairman, and he hadn't ever heard of anybody really doing this before. So I'm working to get a hold of how did Acton negotiate that particular mini system, so that then we can figure out, can we replicate it in other parts of the state? Now, I know it doesn't exactly solve what's happening in Concord, although I'm meeting with the Concord town manager next Friday, I believe, and this is something that I can bring up to him to say, hey, you might want to take a look at how we might be able to use some whatever satellite spots might exist maybe a church is willing to share 20 spaces in the morning and the early afternoon because most of their time is usually taken up on weekends. You know, there are things that we can do to partner with other folks within the town to get that moving. There also was a grant put in for Concord to run a shuttle to various spots throughout the town. That grant has already gone in. I think the team that submitted that grant has gotten some feedback on it, and there's a possibility that they'll get funded through some other grant program, and it will go to various spots, including the commuter rail stops. I hear about this issue of the challenges with public transportation for low-income people, low-income workers, particularly folks who would work here who can't afford to live here. We have the challenge with teachers and law enforcement and other municipal employees as well, that it's hard for folks to afford to live in a place like Acton, Concord, Lexington, Arlington. And then the transportation is not always available in the ways that people need. So I raised those issues with like the folks on Elder Services, the Elder Affairs Committee, as a challenge that we really need to be taking a close look at. So those are some of the ideas that are being offered, and hopefully will get put into the transportation bond bill that's coming out later this session in particular. And so I think it's just a matter of trying to find those opportunities, those grant opportunities to really increase access. And then your final point about transportation between the towns is something that's still, there are groups that are paying attention to that and talking about that, but I don't think it's happening fast enough. And part of it is trying to figure out if there are ways that we can get contracts with Lyft and Uber to get people moving. But I really appreciate the question. You're welcome.
Would you bring us up to date on maybe carbon emissions from power plants? I also think this ties in to your public health expertise because of particulates in the air in the city. And I'm very naive. I don't know how they're coping with this, if they are coping or trying to cut down in the power plants. Thank you.
That is a good question. I don't, from my past, I would have known the answer to that, but I don't know the answer to that right now. My understanding is that we don't have quite as many manufacturing plants that emit like that here in Massachusetts compared to other states. And I think the challenge is the wind blows this way and then we end up with the pollution that's coming from other states. I don't know if anybody else has more information on that particular question. But you know, there are models of, you know, being, I can't exactly remember what it's called, where if you're really a high emitting plant, you buy carbon offsets from another plant that's not emitting quite as much. But I'm not sure, I don't track that. I'm not exactly sure how that plays into all of this. I think there's just been in the state such a focus on particularly transportation as really the main driving source in the state, and doing everything that we can to really head in that direction of addressing so many cars on the road and moving to electric vehicles, and then the building side of things. So that's a great question. I can look into that more.
So you would say that maybe in the city, the air isn't too bad. It's pretty clean. I mean, compared to many other states.
I don't know, actually. I have not looked at, there's like the Toxic Use Reduction Institute and I think other organizations that have data on what air pollution and what particulate matter looks like. I don't recall hearing that we are among the worst in what those emissions really look like, but we can look into it and we can connect later and I can give you my contact information so that we can follow up on this question. Yeah, you're welcome. Mm-hmm.
Is there any serious interest in the legislature about the suggestion that public colleges should be tuition-free?
I would say it's serious among some legislators. I don't know if it's serious at the level of leadership. I think if there were to be anything that would happen, I think it would first happen probably with community colleges to grant greater access at that level. But I don't necessarily see the political will strong enough for debt-free college across the board for public institutions.
I'd be interested in hearing how your thinking is going in terms of the opioid crisis, both what you might have learned from novel things in Portugal and from other, with your studies for your PhD, how you are thinking is the way that we should be going to make major inroads.
Great, thank you for the question. So in my research, I looked at 200 years of drug policy making in the country. And what we've done for all of that period of time, for the most part, is put the responsibility to address and respond to addiction and substance use disorder through the law enforcement and criminal justice system. And we've seen that that really has failed so many individuals and families. It does not put people at the center of a health issue. And so the things that I've really been taking a look at are Section 35. So there are, I think, 16 or 17 states that have a measure where you can, as a family member or a spouse, even a police officer, though they don't really use it, it's more family members, petition the court to involuntarily commit somebody to treatment. But we're the only state that allows men in our state to go to jail settings for that treatment. And what we're finding is that it's really counterproductive to their journey onto achieving sobriety in a state of recovery, because it perpetuates shame and despair, and just really has a negative impact on people. So there is a piece of legislation filed by Representative Balzer that I support, which says that treatment ought to be provided in a treatment center and not in a jail setting. The other thing that happens with folks who are Section 35 is what it's called. Even if they say, yes, I will go, like, fine, I agree to go, they are put in handcuffs when they arrive in the courthouse. And there's no sort of opportunity for the court to say, no, you can take that person out of handcuffs. So we don't do that to people who are struggling with diabetes or heart disease. I'm not really understanding exactly why we're doing it with people who are struggling with addiction, especially if they're saying, yes, I will go, it's fine. So we have some mindsets and some areas that I think we need to address in terms of the way we treat people with humanity. And again, that's counterproductive. The other thing that we do in our state is if someone relapses while they're on parole, that can count as a violation of their parole. Even if they go and commit another crime that has nothing to do, or if their crime had nothing to do with their addiction. And so that's something else that we need to really address, is saying, relapse is part of the recovery process, just like some people with diabetes might have more cake than they should, or might forget to take their insulin when they really need it. And so really looking at this as a chronic illness and not as a moral failing of the individual who's really struggling. The other things to sort of take a look at are how we use our drug courts. So in Portugal, they do have drug courts still, but you don't have to admit guilt to a crime of being addicted in order to get access to treatment. That's how we have things set up here in Massachusetts, that people have to admit that they have some sort of criminality and criminal thinking, and then they can avail themselves of that treatment. And that's not really the right formula for how we want to move things. So those are some of the things that I looked at when I went to Portugal and started to reflect on, but then also just really digging into the laws that we have on the books here in Massachusetts. And I'll say one other thing that is really, really important. And I've spent time at MCI Concord a number of times talking directly with folks who are incarcerated and what their challenges have been. And of the 20 or so men I've spoken to, every single one of them has some sort of trauma in their background. One, he witnessed his mom get murdered when he was 8 years old. Another one was a victim of pre-sex abuse. Another one, was in and out of watching his parents struggle with their own addiction. And so these men grow up and they don't really have a whole lot of opportunities, and they go and they commit crimes, and then now they're incarcerated. And many of them are tremendous leaders. They're people you could sit down and have a beer or a coffee with. And so in many ways, it's lives lost because of the way our system is. So what I've been doing is focused on how do we catch people when they are young, very young, when they're 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 13, 14. I'm raising 2 boys, mind you, so I kind of understand some of the challenges, but not some of the challenges that people really face in raising their children in very low income areas that don't have a whole lot of opportunity. And I grew up in Lowell. I saw a lot of suffering around me when I was growing up. So I filed legislation to look at what are we doing about adverse childhood experiences in our Commonwealth, and what more could we be doing to make sure we're catching people at a young age so that as they grow up into teenagers and young men, they're not off committing violent crimes that then end up incarcerating them and having their lives lost, and they're not around to raise their children, to support their families, to contribute to our society in ways that they probably could be. So I want us to be doing more before we even get to that point too. And addiction ties right into that for sure. So thank you.
Vaping doesn't seem to be a crisis stage, but it is quite a problem. And I wonder, what is the situation as far as the legislature and vaping and some of the national discussion of vaping certain flavors of the cartridges? Great
question. I do think vaping is at a crisis level. As I said, I was the executive director of Tobacco Free Mass. One of the pieces of legislation that I worked on a couple years ago that did pass and get signed into law was increasing the sales age of all tobacco products to 21, and that does include vape products and e-cigarettes. But what it didn't address was the flavors. So there is a push to take flavors out of all tobacco products in the legislature. I also filed legislation to say that you cannot sell tobacco products at any place except for an adult-only retail shop, kind of how we treat alcohol for the most part, except we allow beer and wine in some grocery stores. But for the most part, if you want to buy hard liquor at our state, you have to go to a liquor store. And that ought to be the same case for tobacco products, which are the most addictive products that young people really start off with and get their hands on first. I'm incredibly concerned about the deaths that we're seeing and witnessing because of e-cigarettes and vape products. I do think it's a real big concern. And the thing that's frustrated me since e-cigarettes came on the scene, and I would say this to colleagues and coworkers and folks who are part of the Tobacco Free Mass Coalition and even legislators, how insidious the tobacco companies and the tobacco industry is, and that I could sort of see it. I saw the writing on the wall that we would be exactly where we are right now, because they would try to make the claim, well, it helps people quit smoking. But if you look at their marketing, it's make the switch. It's not make the switch to quit smoking or let us help you quit smoking. It's make the switch. So what they really want is for people to stop using combustible products and just replace it with e-cigarettes. And I have friends and loved ones who have really struggled to get off of e-cigarettes and actually probably consumed much more nicotine than they were if they were smoking combustible cigarettes. Granted, they're not getting all the tar and all of the other chemicals that come along with combustibles, but they're still very problematic. And I am very concerned about what's happening with our young people, and knowing that it primes the brain in so many ways around that addiction pathway. That is something that's really important for us to get a hold on. And I do think it is a crisis. So I really appreciate the question. And we'll see what happens at the federal level if flavors are banned through the FDA. It's a promising thing. We'll see if it happens.
A much less discussed issue in Massachusetts is the inadequate preparation of prisoners for reentry.
Yep.
There are waiting lists for the few vocational positions available in prisons. Not everyone has access.
Okay.
The program of BU at Norfolk is good, but why so limited?
Right.
The model, perhaps, or a model, is the Bard College Prison Initiative, where faculty teach in the prisons, and they have awarded, now I believe it's more than 40 degrees in prison.
And so the question, and I apologize, I think I've been forgetting to restate the question or the comment, but so Ken's comment is about what we're doing for prisoners for reentry, and the fact that our state could be doing a lot more. And you cited specifically, is it Bard College, B-A-R-D? Bard College has a particular model where faculty go into the prisons and provide educational opportunities to folks who are incarcerated. I completely agree. I met with a gentleman who is a professor at MIT who is starting up a consortium of institutions that are providing educational services and opportunities within the prisons to see if they can get some standardization across all of the institutions of higher ed that provide some educational opportunities, and then also figure out are there ways that they can do credit sharing and swapping and that kind of thing. So I think there is an intention and a desire for some of the institutions to really work together because they realize there's a inconsistency and there are gaps, and there are inconsistencies in what folks within the Department of Corrections are able to receive. It's something that I just had a conversation with somebody, Senator Eldridge, who's been really big on criminal justice reform. I've been talking to him since even before I was sworn in. What can we do for folks who are incarcerated to have more of a focus on rehabilitation? And that includes vocational and educational. I'm not aware of the vocational having a waiting list, so I might want some more information from you on that. Are you saying when folks get out of jail or prison that they don't have vocational access opportunities, or are you saying within the correctional institution?
Within the prison.
Yes, okay.
There aren't sufficient spots for all the prisoners.
I've heard that, and the one thing that I'm wondering about too, I did a tour of the laborers a week and a half ago, and one of the things that they highlighted was the fact that they do work with folks who were previously incarcerated. I'm wondering what we can do to start to forge those relationships even earlier. And one of the things that I learned when I toured MCI Framingham, but also MCI Concord, is the lack of apprenticeships and the lack of opportunities. And I think that's what you're indicating here, yes. So one of the things that I also spoke about with Senator Eldridge just a couple hours ago is the need for us to get a real handle on what the programming is. There was a report done in the last couple years by folks at the Boston Foundation, I think it was, and Mass Inc., focused on how much are we spending on prisons and finding that their budgets continue to increase, but their programming is declining and a lot of things are closing up, and wanting to understand a little bit more why that is and what's driving that. So in the legislature, we can be more effective to say it's really important for people in their livelihoods. It's really important for our communities and our society that when people are released, that they are prepared for what kind of work they're going to be facing and what kind of world they'll be facing. And one of the conversations I had with folks who are at MCI Concord is the desire to have more opportunities to have step down. Oftentimes they're released directly from maximum without having the benefit of practicing with less security. And that is a real, one of the drivers of a little bit of disaster that we see with recidivism. And folks who get released from prison, they are at the greatest risk for overdosing on opioids. They're 120 times higher than the average population. And part of it is the training, the access, the education, et cetera, et cetera. So it is really important that we're paying more attention to reentry. And it's one of the budget asks that I had when I met with the chairman of Ways and Means. And one of the things that I advocated more for was more money going into reentry services. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. Yes. To follow up, MCI, the farm, you may know of this, for a number of years now has had a program of work release. I'm involved with, I work at a store in West Concord, where for a number of years we've had wonderful workers coming, and they're delivered by the prison van, and they pick them up at the end of their 8-hour shift, and they've been wonderful to get them. They're working 8 hours, 5 days a week, and then they go back to their home.
Right.
And it's a great program, but I wish it could be expanded. I don't know if anybody knows about it or not, but we have found it at Denver's Natural Gourmet. I'll give a plug for that place. It's very, very successful. They've been wonderful, wonderful workers.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that. So just the experience with working with folks at Northeast Correctional who are on work release and how much of a support they provide as employees, and sounds like they're really valued. So it'd be great to figure out how we can replicate that. So thank you for that comment.
Two related questions. Last year, our climate group supported the carbon tax by Senator Barrett and others, and didn't make the final cut. This year, Senator Benson and some others are supporting a new one, and I'm wondering if that has any better chances of passing this year, carbon tax, with complicated formulas about distribution of funds. That's part of my question. The second part is, we do have a lobbying group within our larger group, and we're heading back now and want to know what particular climate bills we should be supporting this session.
Great.
Thank you, and help me.
Thank you. Great questions, Bobby. So the first is the carbon pricing legislation that was put forth by Senator Barrett. I think maybe even this is his third session, I'm not sure, but definitely a second session where he's filed this. And then Rep. Benson has filed another separate version of it. I'm not so sure that those are necessarily going to move. They weren't included in the Greenworks legislation that passed the House. I think there's a lot of disagreement between the House and the Senate on a whole host of pieces of legislation, unfortunately. But it does seem like there's even more challenges, in particular, it seems like, around what to do around climate. I think on the House side, the leadership is more interested in adaptation and mitigation and resilience, and not so much on some of the bigger, bolder policies. So I don't know where that's going to go, I'll be honest. I think the thing that is probably one of the most important, the second part of Bobby's question was, what legislation, what climate-related legislation should her lobbying group be focused on? I would say focus on the roadmap bill and tie it to 100% renewable. Those are probably two, and certainly advocate for the carbon tax. I think that's really, really important, but
Repeat the bill.
the roadmap bill, which will really set out what are the milestones for us to achieve, and then the 100% renewable. And you might hear folks say, oh, the 100% renewable, we can't get to 100% renewable by a certain year because the technology doesn't exist. But by the time we get to 80% renewable or even 60% renewable, because it's going to take us a while to get there, we might have the technology on board. And it's just better to keep pushing forward rather than just to say, oh, we got to wait for everything to be perfect before we act. Now is the time for us to act. Technology, I'm confident, at some point will catch up and will at least be closer to where we really need to be. So I hope that answers your question. But the carbon bills are really an important component, and I think we need to continue to push on them. I wouldn't say not to push on them, but the roadmap and 100% renewable.
My other question is, I know that they passed a non-binding resolution at the conference last weekend about transparency. Do you think that has any chance of getting support from Mr. DeLeo and or whoever?
Great question. So at the Mass Democratic Convention this past weekend, we passed a whole host of resolutions, and two of them have to do with the legislature specifically. One is the transparency measure, which will require that committee votes are made public. And there's a pledge that an organization called Act on Mass is asking legislators and senators to sign onto, which I was one of the first folks to sign on to that, to say, yes, I will publish my committee votes and make those public. And yes, I will stand up for roll call votes. That's the other thing that's been really hard is if we're not standing for roll call votes, you don't know how each senator or representative voted on a particular issue, so you don't know how to hold them accountable, back to the introduction of holding me to account. So that was part of the transparency resolution that passed this past weekend at the Democratic Convention. I don't know where that might or might not go. I don't think it would be necessarily standalone legislation, but it might be something that we can pick up on in the next legislative session, not starting until 2021. But this is a question that I have for some of my colleagues who have been there longer than I have. Does this give us an opportunity? Does this give us some leverage to say this is really what the people of Massachusetts want? This is what the Democrats at the Democratic Convention said that they wanted. So I just need to do a little bit more digging to find out where we are. As far as I know, The speaker did not support our efforts to make committee votes public during our rules debate. I think if he had been supportive of those, then they would have passed, because a lot of my colleagues would have voted along with him on that, along with the other 2 measures that we took up in the House rules debate. So I think it's really important that citizens, all of you, just kind of keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening around transparency. It sounds like a silly thing, right? It sounds like it's a no-brainer, it should already exist. And this is not anything that Speaker DeLeo himself has done. This has been going in operation and building for the last 30 years. So we're trying to have a course correction around something that's been in existence, since I was about, 10 years old. So it's going to take a little bit to get there. But I appreciate the question and you highlighting what happened with those resolutions. Bobby?
Thank you all for coming, because we've had quite an hour, an exhausting hour of what one person does in the legislature. My head is spinning. So if we're spinning, just think how much she is working on our behalf. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Bobby. Appreciate it. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for having me. Appreciate it. And I'll stick around if you have questions.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you, I will.
I'll leave this up here just
Okay,
in case someone
Sure.
wants to still. Wow, wasn't that the whole gambit?
This is exactly, this is what it's like.